Right, well, my name is Martin Edwards, but much more importantly, the name of the guest of honour I'll be interviewing today, Mr. Peter Lovesey. As he's described on the cover of his first novel, Mr. Peter Lovesey. You don't get that with publishers nowadays.
It was a very long time ago. And I'm hoping, Martin, that your memory is better than mine.
Well, I've been a fan of Peter's since I was a teenager, when I was reading the Criff books and then watching the TV series.
That really dates me, doesn't it?
He keeps us all feeling young. Peter needs no introduction. I've written a piece about him in the programme, which some of you may have seen, but really the focus today is on taking a guided tour through the career of someone who is not just one of Britain's finest crime writers of the last 50 years, but one of the world's finest crime writers of the last 50 years. And as a fan, it's a great privilege for me to have been asked to interview Peter. So, we're going to begin more or less at the beginning. I'm going to ask you, Peter, just to tell us a little bit about your early life and how you got into writing in the first place.
Oh, yes. I grew up in suburban London. I was born in 1936. I'm not going to sort of tell you each year from on. The most exciting thing about my childhood, I suppose, was World War II, and going to school during World War II, and being bombed. We were bombed in 1944 by one of those V1s, we called them doodlebugs as kids, flying bombs that Hitler sent over from France, pilotless planes really, that crashed anywhere, and one happened to crash in our garden. Fortunately, all my family survived. My two brothers were in the house, but they were sheltering under a Morrison tabletop shelter, one of those cast iron shelters. And my mother had gone shopping, my father was in the army, and I was at school. So that was a huge event.
Yeah.
But the upshot of it was that we were homeless, and for a time my parents, their main priority was providing food for the family and clothes for us. So books. Although I was by that time, I suppose 8 or 9 years old, I was passionate about reading. I didn't have anything to read in the house. All my books had gone. And then one day my father brought home 2 books. One was The Life of Sir Edward Marshall Hall. He got them from a charity, I think, from one of the women's charities that supported people who were bombed out. And The Life of Sir Edward Marshall Hall, which didn't sound a very promising title to an 8-year-old boy. And the other one was even worse to my ear. It was a sort of religious-sounding book called Elias the Saint. But it turned out that The Life of Sir Edward Marshall Hall was a very exciting book about one of the great barristers, defence lawyers of the first half of the 20th century. And he was involved in many of the big cases, the Brides in the Bath, and the Green Bicycle murder, the Camden Town murders, and so on. And these lovely titles really sort of caught my imagination, and I learnt a lot of new words as I read these books. Very exciting for me as a kid. And then finally I had to turn to the religious book, as I thought it was, but it wasn't. It wasn't Elias the Saint. It was Alias the Saint. By Leslie Charteris. So that was a great find, and that was the first crime novel I ever read. You can see that it rooted in me from an early age was this interest in crime of the fictional and the non-fictional kind.
Yes, and Leslie Charteris, who won the Diamond Dagger, as you were later to do. So
yes, that was lovely. He won the Diamond Dagger in the year I was chairman of the Crime Writers. So I presented it to him, and it was lovely to meet him and tell him my little story. And he was quite amused by it, and inscribed a couple of books for me. He was a delightful, lovely man. He died the following year, unfortunately. So I'm carrying on with my life story. After that, it was a long gap, and then I went through school. I was hopeless at sports at school, but wanted to know a lot about sports, simply to keep up with the other boys. So taught myself a lot, listened to the radio, read the newspapers, read all the books I could get on sport as I went through my sort of grammar school. And got to be quite an expert on athletics. And eventually started writing articles about running. And a book followed in 1968, and that was the first book I ever published, called The Kings of Distance. It had some nice reviews, didn't sell very many, but it was an encouragement, and I knew I could finish a book.
You were on your way, and that's a good thing,
that's right.
To a young writer.
And then there followed the competition that sort of set me up as a crime writer.
Tell us about the competition.
Well, I still carry around with me the entry form. We saw it, Jax, my wife, and I were looking at a newspaper and saw an advert that said first crime novel competition. I think it was in the Times. Cash prizes offered. Right to Lord Harding of Penshurst at Macmillan. So Jax said, well, you've written one book. And I said, yes, but that was a sports book. That was about runners. And she read a lot of crime stories, and she said, well, you could do one. I think you could probably write a crime story. Let's send off for the particulars. So I sent off for the particulars, and I still carry them around and show them at every talk I ever give, because there was something about the competition that appealed to me. There it was. That's the original money in those days. £1,000 was more than my salary. By that time, I'm a teacher, and it was more than my salary. So it was a huge incentive, and we sent off for the particulars, and I still thought I wasn't going to be able to write a crime novel, but Jack said, well, why not use the running background? Because, you see, most of the books at that time were kind of country house mysteries, or a little bit in that tradition. They had some lovely cliches in those books that still delight me. The sort of thing, I expect you're all wondering why I asked you to gather in the library. It sort of creates a whole picture, doesn't it? I wouldn't go in there if I were you, Miss Armitage. It's not a pretty sight. or I'm afraid Uncle Henry won't be down for dinner. Look at the dog, I think it knows something. So there we were, with this idea that perhaps I could use the running as the background, and I did. And I while I'd been researching the long distance running for that earlier book, I'd come across accounts of 6-day races that took place in Islington in the agricultural hall. Around a small track, and it was an amazing thing. People would come along and bet on. There was big crowds in Victorian times supported this strange event of a go-as-you-please contest, where people could walk or run or totter or crawl around a track for 6 days on end. There were little tents by the side where they'd come off and have a rest, and they usually had trainers with them. And there's a lot of betting on not just how many miles somebody would do, but who would be leading at the end of the day, or whether somebody would get through the night. So it was a big, exciting thing in Victorian times. And it occurred to me that it wasn't so very different in format from the country house murder, because instead of the people all going away for a weekend, you see, they were all stuck in the big hall for a few days. The runners couldn't go out of the hall, and the trainers were tied to them, were with them. So it was basically all set around that particular event. And I wrote the story. I found out that they used tiny